So that, like, sometimes, and I give a lot of input on that. Like, one of my students, I gave her like a 7-minute recording of my explanation of what was essentially a minor problem. But that's because she's so deep now into the writing. Like, there's so many things that we can now focus on that are really gonna, like, really get to bring out her voice as a writer, her uniqueness, her perspective. Like, it'll bring those things out. So the first paper is kind of like, here are the things that you need to do, and then that's the input, and it actually takes a lot less out of, like, from me, even though the problems are a little more complex. But once you start getting that down, then we can start looking at, like, okay, so if someone else is reading this, how are they going to perceive it? And I think too, like, I noticed that in the reflections, there's a lot of discussion about, well, I don't feel like I explained my evidence very well. Yeah, maybe that's something you've got to work on, but wait a second now, hold on, you're doing it. And that's huge. When I was teaching writing or English 122, which is the next course that most of you probably won't need to take, that was always the hardest thing for my students to do, on top of all the things we've already discussed. So if that's what you're already able to do, you have a huge advantage. And I think too, what you need to understand is when you go to Michigan State, if and transfer, and you're able to do the things that we've discussed in this class well, you're going to have a huge advantage over their Comp 1 students. So, like, actual MSU students, their class doesn't prepare you for their courses as well as this one does. And I know that because I talk to a lot of their professors who teach out of the department. So, like, they teach, history and literature and things like that. This class is meant to prepare you for that as well. So it should feel like it's like, I would hope that you feel like you're being challenged a bit in this class. Not everybody probably is being challenged as much as I'd like to challenge everybody, but that says more about their preparation before they came to the class. But there's always something, there's always a way to get better. But I thought the reflections they were insightful to me. And I'll see if I can address some of the things that were brought up over the next 8 weeks. Last thing before we actually start, obviously next week is spring break, so we won't be meeting as a class, obviously, right? In fact, I pretty much shut it down during spring break as far as I'll answer emails occasionally, but I've got some other work to catch up on. But I am going to open up the next 2 weeks. Well, let's just say the following week. If you'd like to get in and start working ahead a little bit, you can. But also because with Essay 3, there is an interview that's part of it, and we're going to talk about that interview today. But you might want to get started on the interview and maybe do more. But also, I've in my 2 ORT classes and my synchronous online class, I've really noticed that students are working ahead this semester more than they typically do. So I'll open all of them up. If you're behind, it's a good time to catch up. I don't want to destroy your spring break and ruin it by any means, but it is a really good time to get yourself caught up, especially on papers. And so if you're going to catch yourself up, get yourself caught up specifically on the papers. In fact, I'm going to hide the discussion boards for the time being simply because I think students delude themselves and think, well, if I do enough discussion boards, I'll pass the class. You won't. The only way you'll pass the class is if you turn in the papers. And so that, I really want you to dial in and focus on doing that. And I will still take essays 1 and 2 final drafts. And if you write a final draft, turn in a rough draft too. Just turn it. I mean, if it's the same one, that's fine. But the rough drafts actually really add up as far as your grade is concerned. Let's see. But I guess that's probably about it. Any questions before we get started today? Okay, so my experience with spring break has usually been this. When I taught at 4-year colleges and universities, students would party like rock stars during spring break, typically. my experience has been at LCC that students actually don't usually leave town, and probably even more so this year. And so, in fact, most students, it seems like if they can, they work additional hours. If you, I know that, you know, and some of you probably should because you don't, there's not going to be much work for you to do. But if you're behind, make sure that catching up is you know, near the top of the list of the things you do, if not the very top. All right, so let's switch gears here and actually talk about something related to your paper. So essay 3 is based, all of this is based on an interview. The essay, the whole essay kind of hinges on this interview of someone that you know who lived through some sort of interesting event, and interesting is a very broad term. I know some of you have already established who you're going to interview, and so we're going to talk about how to do that, but I also want you to think, if you haven't decided yet, these are just some things to consider as you settle on a person to interview. Let's see. So the historical part of this essay is important, but it's not really as important as the interview, because the interview kind of gives you all of your material. And that's why it might be useful to think about a person versus a subject. And so if you can think of a person who just, you know, maybe they're a really good storyteller, maybe they love to talk, maybe they have lots and lots of opinions, or they have a great memory, or all of the above, those are people who are going to make good interview subjects. Because you want someone, one, who's not afraid to say what they think. In fact, the more honest they are, the better. If someone is sort of lacking a filter, that's actually a fun person to interview, and you can get a lot of really good stuff out of them. If the person is more like has a little bit less of a filter, sometimes you can sort of finesse them and get them to open up a bit. And we'll talk about how to do that in a second. But it might be good to be a little more flexible on the topic and maybe focus more on finding the right person to interview. Because most subject matter will fit what we're doing. I mean, there's a way to make just about any interview fit. Understand too that an interview is subject to interpretation. So like how you interpret the responses is going to be unique to your perspective. Just keep that in mind. I'm not really expecting any of you to, the goal of this assignment is not to simply tell me or report on the interview. This is what they said. That's not really what you're doing. You're trying to tell the story of their experience. And that means you're going to do some interpreting along the way. So, but the first thing you got to do is get them to talk. And you're going to need some good questions to get them started. So, if you want to take some notes on this, you can. There's a handout on it, but it's pretty dense. Some things to keep in mind with interview questions. Number one, questions should be simple. Really, really one of the great questions to ask is, what happened? What happened during this event? What happened to you during this event? What happened to your friends during this event? What happened to your parents during this event? Another one is, can you give me an example of, or can you tell me a story about blank? Or just simply give the command, describe blank. Describe Vietnam, or what it was like being in Vietnam. And then once you ask that question, the next thing you're going to do is listen. But questions should be relatively I think I've found this to be the case too. If I ask a complicated question, I don't get very good answers. If I ask one question at a time, I tend to get better answers. And if you look at my assignment sheets, my prompts are usually one question. And if they're not one question, I don't usually get great answers. Because people don't know what to do. Like, which question do you answer? Do you try to answer both? It always drove me nuts in interviews when you'd sit there and someone would ask you like 3 questions in a row, all together. And it's like, well, why didn't you just ask me 3 separate questions so I can think about each one individually rather than trying to like wrap this answer up for 3 questions into one response. So one question at a time, and you can keep them relatively simple. Open-ended is always good too. The best questions are those which elicit the longest answers from the respondent. So like the more they talk, the better. So if you sit there and ask a question and 15 minutes passes by and they're still talking, they're still answering that question, you just hit pay dirt. Like in the world of interviewing, you just hit, gold. So that's actually a good thing. If you're not talking much during an interview, you're just asking the questions, maybe asking a few follow-up questions, that's good. Don't ask questions that can be answered with one word. Did you like blank? Did you like going to Vietnam? No. The question would be, why didn't you like, or why did you like or dislike going to Vietnam? That's a better question. So avoid questions with one-word answers. They're very frustrating because you'll ask the question and you get that yes or no, and then it's like, darn it. Don't ask questions that require your respondents to do your analysis for you. This is your job. So in other words, like this is not really so much about what they think, though that's something you can ask, but you're the one you're the one who's going to create the narrative, and you're the one who's going to decide what it all means, not them. They can give you that insight. They can tell you what they think about certain things, but in the end, it's really going to be about what you think. Do not ask for hearsay or opinions on behalf of the group they are a part of. So like, what do people around here think of X? You rarely get anything interesting. So it's what you want their perspective. You don't want them answering the question for others. So what did all your friends think about this? Well, who knows? Because like that was a long time ago and I don't remember. What did your family think? That could be an interesting that could be an interesting question, but like usually what they say is, well, I didn't really like it. And so you got to ask the follow-up. Why didn't they like it? What was upsetting about it? And that's fine. But the better question is, why did or didn't your family find this upsetting? Just ask that question right out of the gate. And then last, don't be afraid to ask embarrassing questions. If you don't ask, they won't tell. And I shouldn't say like embarrassing maybe isn't even the right word, but though I guess it's part of it. But don't be afraid to ask questions that maybe they're not eager to answer. When you ask people questions about wars, there's things that they're probably going to avoid telling you. I'm just going to be honest with you because they're worried about how you'll see them. Now, if you're interviewing someone who's been through therapy and has been treated for PTSD and served like a Vietnam vet, they're actually a lot more likely to answer the questions because they've been answering them for a while now. They've been talking about this stuff before, and so maybe they're going to be a little more open about it. And the other thing you might find is that they simply, like I've had students interview Vietnam vets, and the response, the respondent would avoid certain things that happened. So like, I think in one case, she knew some of the stories that her grandfather had, I don't know if he told her parents or what, or whatever, but that she knew something had happened in Vietnam, and she was kind of hoping that he would talk about it, and he just simply danced around it, like he wouldn't answer the question. And I think part of that is it's always, not always, but sometimes I think grandparents want their grandchildren to see them in a certain light. And so they're very careful about what they say. It's hard to be honest about some things. And it's not just war, it's a lot of things. It's hard to be honest about mistakes. It's hard to be honest about failures. It's hard to be honest about embarrassments. And so sometimes people either avoid it or they just change their history. So this is not a perfect science. This is just one more way of looking at history, but it's not a perfect history by any means. So types of questions or interview talk. So ask direct questions. Did you ever get frustrated as you were waiting to get shipped to Vietnam? Or, did you ever get frustrated, or were you ever angry, or what was the time in which you were angry about this event? Or um, what did you think? Like in a case, I'm going to use an example from my childhood. I think I've mentioned it before, the church burning down. Um, I would probably ask someone, like, what was your first reaction when you saw the church on fire, the smoke rising in a distance? And then what was the reaction of others as they were gathered around the church? I might ask those questions. I also might ask them to just simply just say, so what were you doing that day? And then when you heard something had happened, how did you hear about it? Or I might ask those kinds of questions. And then I might ask them, so what were some things that you had heard from others about the event? And it's one of the reasons you do research is so that you can answer better questions. So when you're talking to a soldier, you can say, like, well, so what kind of gun did you have? You know the answer to the question, but you want to get them to talk about the gun because then they might talk about something else. Um, what part of Vietnam were you in? Or in the case of the church, um, what was the thing that you loved most about that church? What was the thing that you most remember about it? Can you describe that to me? That kind of question. Indirect questions are they're not very effective questions, I don't think, because you're not really addressing the issue. So like in this case, what do most people people around here think of the ways that management treats staff? It would be simpler to say, what do you think of the way management treats its staff? But by saying most people, then that person they're not answering the question themselves, they're answering it for others, and they're actually more likely to be honest in that respect. So an indirect question is a way to get an answer from someone who doesn't want you to know what they think. They're afraid of, or they're concerned. So like in this case, they don't want it to get back to management that they said this, so they're saying, well, this is just what other people say, not me. And sometimes that's useful, but for this assignment, I don't think it will be as much. Structuring questions. Sometimes you've got to move people along. Maybe they've exhausted a topic, and so maybe it's time to switch over to something else that you thought of or another question that you have. Follow-up questions are always good questions. When I'm working in a group of people and I'm trying to get them to move along, I'll ask a structuring question. But when I think something's really important and I want to know what people think, and they're not telling me, one, that drives me nuts, but two, I try to ask a really good follow-up question. Like I did this the other day. I said, someone was telling me about what they were doing to help students, and I said, how much time did that take you? Now, why did I ask that question? Because I want to know how much they need to be paid to do that again. And that's what we're trying to do, is make sure they get paid for their work. So a follow-up question is a way to kind of to get more information. And I think sometimes you ask a follow-up question because you simply don't know something. Like they talked about something and you don't know what they're talking about. And you want to know, because if you know, you'll understand their experience that much better. So follow-up questions can be really useful. And I think what you'll find is they tend to be like extemporaneous, that you come up with a follow-up question, just sort of all this, like they're answering a question and something comes up in their answer and you realize that you don't understand it or you want to know more about it, and that's when you ask the follow-up question. Probing questions, they're kind of just like direct questions, and they're really just follow-up questions. Specifying questions. So if someone is telling a story and they get to a certain point and there's more to tell, this is when you start to ask the specifying questions. Like, oh, so the church was burning down and people started to gather. What did you do then? What did you look for? What was your next? What was the game plan? Those kinds of things. And that kind of keeps people talking too. Those kinds of questions. Then what happened? Then what'd you do? What were you thinking? Was there anyone else there? Those kinds of questions. Interpreting questions. And I think sometimes, I don't know that you'll really be asking many of these, but these are like kind of like, what do you think questions? You know, what does this mean to you? Or how did this, so like in the case of the church burning down, the question might be, how was the parish changed as a result of that church burning down? And I would not ask that question at the beginning. I'd ask it at the end of the interview. How were things different? Um, because I think people, if they don't think about that, it's a great opportunity for them to think about it and sort of wonder about it themselves. All right, so this is we're going to get into some practical stuff here. Should you record and transcribe the interview? And my answer to this is you should be doing something. Don't think that you're just going to ask questions and remember the answers. That is insane. You're not. And you're going to miss details. Like, you're going to miss all the good stuff because you're not writing it down. So, like, should you record or and transcribe? You should be doing something. Take notes, something. Something needs to be done there so that you have that, all that good stuff, all that, those great stories and details so that you can use them later. And you want that detail. That's going to be really helpful in writing your essays. So what are the pros? You're not going to remember everything. If you record it or transcribe it or take notes, you will. It allows a more thorough examination of what people say. Kind of look at the words. And so if, like, what they're talking about is transcribing. Like, literally, this is what the person said in looking at a transcript. It permits repeated examinations of the interviewee's answers. And not that, like, you're not going to probably go over and like examine the interviewee's answers multiple times, but you may want to go back and to a couple specific things they say and think about what that means or what the importance of that is. Like, you may just want to like contemplate it, or maybe you want to use it somewhere in your paper. Maybe you want that, you're going to add some dialogue and it's going to be the answers that they gave you because they're such interesting things, or they're things that really captured your attention. These, you know, maybe it's just a short sentence, but you remembered it after the interview and you want to go back to it. So capturing that can be really helpful. If you do quote people, if you're going to interview someone, be prepared for the fact that they may want to see your essay. Not everybody does, but sometimes people do, and especially grandparents. And if they do, you want to make sure that you get your quotes right, because when they look at the quote, you want it, you know, you don't want them to look at the quote and say, well, that's not what I said. You know what I mean? Yeah, you all know what I mean. That's not always a great thing. All right, so the cons of this, as soon as someone knows that you're recording and or taking notes, sometimes they get more self-conscious. They become aware. They know that you're going to be recording their answers, and now they're thinking about like, oh, this is going to be, you know, captured forever. It's one thing to sit down and talk to you. It's another thing to know that this conversation could live on, you know, and it might actually make them less open. That's a risk you take. So what do? Well, you try to make it less obvious. Like, taking notes is it's usually not real bad. But if you put a camera in front of someone and say, okay, talk, well, then then they're going to become more self-conscious and more self-aware, and they all know what a camera means, that this is going to be captured. Whereas notes show, if you're taking notes, it shows you're interested, very interested. And so they might be they still might be hesitant to tell you exactly, like, to be completely and totally candid, but at least they know that you're interested. Now, you want people to be candid. You really do. You want them to really say what they're thinking. And sometimes that's simply a matter of of only asking questions and kind of prompting them along, and ask those specifying questions, or nodding, you know, and giving a lot of eye contact. So it's clear you're listening, but the longer you let people talk, the more likely they are to say something that is very honest. Honesty is good in interviews. It's really hard to get people to really, really open up. But when you do, then you get all the good stuff. If you're going to record it, you need good equipment. So like your computer, your phone, whatever it is, like if your phone has a tendency to die or just a very weak battery or whatever, use a laptop or something. Use something that you can rely on. You can transcribe it. I wouldn't bother. Transcription will take you 3 or 4 hours. And transcribing is literally like going through, whether it's a video or a voice recording, and then typing it all out. Yikes. Like that's a lot of work. That's a whole lot of work. And it's really not going to be that beneficial, to be honest with you. It's probably going to be overwhelming. That's why journalists and writers rarely, they might have the transcription, but they're not going to do it themselves because it's just too overwhelming. 2 things that you have as part of your LCC email account are Google Docs and then Google Meet. So Google Meet, if you're going to conduct the interview over something, over a computer, let's say, and I like if it's someone, if you're going to interview someone older, you either will have to or you should use something like Google Meet. But Google Meet is really simple to use, and it has excellent captioning, like fantastic captioning. And that's part of your LCC account. So you can set up the meeting and there's a link. It's a lot like WebEx, but it's actually simpler to use. And then you just send them the meeting link and then they can open it up when they're ready. And then you can just start talking. And you can start asking your questions and they can start answering. And what you'll see is the captioning. So like, as long as they're English, as long as they're pretty clear and they're speaking, you'll be able to see what they're saying as well as hear it. Now, if they're, if they're older or maybe they have a strong accent, maybe they're a second language speaker, it might not be quite as, it's not going to be quite as accurate. But if, like me, when I use it, Google Meet pretty much captions exactly what I say. It rarely makes mistakes. All right, the other thing that you could use to capture the interview is Google Docs. And I'm going to, actually, I'll show you that in a second. Let's just keep going here. All right, knowledgeable. So what do you need to be as an interviewer? Well, you need to be knowledgeable. And this is where you kind of need to know a little bit, not kind of, you need to know something about what you're interviewing them about. If it is something like a war or 9/11, or, I've had students who wrote about the experience of their, one person wrote about their uncle being at the Berlin Wall when it was taken down. Those big events, it's good to have some background knowledge. But if the person you're interviewing has sort of chosen a topic, then you might actually end up doing more research after the fact, because you may not be able to, you may not know what they're going to talk about, or maybe they just, what they're going to talk about, but it's something that's not easy to research. And it might be more useful to just really focus on the interview and then go back and fill in some of the research where you need to. So the church burning down in my hometown, I'm not going to go to it happened I think it happened in 1961. So it's not like it's going to be, fresh in the databases. But the other thing is, it didn't really get much reporting beyond Lansing. So I think it might have been in the State Journal. So I could go back and look at State Journal archives. There's actually the church archive has probably the most information. So I could look at a book on it. And that's probably about it. So research for this essay, that source, you have that primary source, but for some topics, it's just not real feasible. It's not going to, it may not work. And so you're going to have to fill in some of those gaps yourself. But if you don't know anything about the Vietnam War and you're going to ask, going to interview someone about it, you better learn something because you're not going to know what to ask, right? They're going to probably give you some things to think about, but you're going to need to, you need to understand what they're referring to some degree. Now, how do you do that? Well, history.com would work, Wikipedia would work. This is not super intense research. It's just so you get a kind of a base understanding of the subject matter. So keep that in mind. It really, like, how knowledgeable you should be really will depend on the subject. Structuring it. So like we're going to shoot for about 10 questions, maybe more, maybe less. You might find that, you know, once you start interviewing someone, once they get on a roll, they answer multiple questions with one answer. The interviews, like I would schedule anywhere from an hour to 2 hours, depending on the person. If you only get an hour, ask them if they'll do a follow-up. You know, because you might, a lot of students, if they can, they like to do a follow-up after the rough draft. Just because that then they kind of know what they need, and you don't really know that the first time around sometimes. Not every, and most people, like most students, I should say, not most students don't do follow-ups and don't necessarily need to or can't, but there's always a few that are like, that I say, can you follow up with the person? Because, you know, here's some things that would really be interesting to know more about. And if you ask them during the first interview if they'll do a follow-up, it's good. Then you've kind of got it taken care of. Like, it's not a surprise when they call you in 2 weeks. Again, keep the questions simple, clear. Don't get fancy with your language. Just a few words. Like make them really open-ended questions that are clear. And one question per question, not multiple questions per question. Always let people finish. If it's a little uncomfortably quiet, that's okay. Let them finish. Don't feel the need to fill the silences. Sometimes people got to reach back into their memory and pull stuff out. And I know for me that takes a second once in a while. So sensitive. It's really good to listen to what people are saying. It's a little bit harder when you're using computers because you can't really see people's, like, you don't get the nonverbal cues that you would get if you're sitting in front of them in a face-to-face interview. But sometimes people are a little more open in digital interviews, whether it's over the phone or using something like FaceTime or Google Meet, or WebEx or whatever. So, but it's good to pay close attention. Sometimes they will let you know non-verbally that they're upset about something or they just don't want to discuss it. Sometimes they also let you know non-verbally that they're not answering the question and you might have to push a little harder. I've had some students really push people hard on this. Their papers were much better because of it, but, like, you know, grandma got kind of cornered sometimes by an aggressive grandchild. And so I can think of one case specifically where I had a student who interviewed her grandmother. Her grandmother came from Vietnam. I think it's one of the sample essays, or was for a long time. Her grandma came from Vietnam, and it was just a horrible, horrible journey. Like, her family was wealthy in Vietnam. They had to basically give away all of their wealth just to get on a crowded boat where, like, I think a third of the people on the boat died on the trip to Laos, where that's where the refugee camp was. It was just, the story was just incredible, but her grandma wouldn't talk about it. And she told her mom, like, hey, I'm not going to get a C on this paper because grandma doesn't want to talk about this. Like, she said she was going to talk about it. She's not. And so, like, she kind of had to follow her grandma around all day and just keep asking. And finally, her grandmother broke down and told the whole story. And I think her grandma actually felt really a lot better about it afterward. But, like, sometimes you have to be aware that people are tapping into something that either they haven't thought about in a while, or sometimes it's just sort of, it's tough. It's tough to recall, and you've spent a lot of time, you know, and they've spent a lot of their lives putting it behind them. But the other side of that is there's a history there that helps you. Like, if you're interviewing your grandparents, what they tell you gives you a better sense of who you are as a person. You will understand yourself better. And you will also understand the difficulties that people face in their lives. And when you face difficulties, you will understand that this is part of life rather than thinking, oh, it's just me, I'm getting screwed, or, I'm getting a bad deal. Instead, you think, no, you think back to grandma's journey from Vietnam and think, okay, you know what, this life is hard sometimes. It just is. And I've just got to persevere because that's what grandma did on that boat. And then she spent 6 months at a refugee camp, picking dead fish off the beach to eat because there wasn't enough food. And then finally she made it to the US and she couldn't speak the language and she didn't know what kind of job she was going to get. And while they helped her find a place to live and food, they had to start over again. Education didn't matter. And so I think they started a restaurant. So then they had to start this restaurant and they had to do all the work and they saved everything they could. And then they bought a house and then, and so like, there's a lot behind these stories that will in so many ways make you better appreciate how much people struggled before you were like, so that you could be on this planet. So their story matters, even if they don't want to tell it. It's really important. Always let people finish. Always let them. Don't interrupt them. Even if you like, if you have a follow-up question, wait until they're done talking, because you'll interrupt them and then they'll lose their train of thought. And then be open. We already talked about sensitivity. Be open. And don't judge people. I mean, don't do that generally, I guess. But like in an interview, don't make it clear that you're judging someone. If they did something that's surprising, like you're like, you did that. Don't like try to hide the look of disgust or like judginess from your face, because everybody's done things. I mean, it's sometimes you look at your parents and your grandparents and you think, man, they are so like prim and proper and boring. Some of you might even think that. And then they tell you, I remember my dad when I was a kid or when I was a teenager. No, actually, no, I was an adult. My dad just seemed like the biggest, straight arrow ever. Like he was in no way a rebel. But one day he said, yeah, I went to see Johnny Cash once. Now, my dad saying that, it might as well have been, Kiss or something. But for him to say that just blew my mind. I didn't even know he was a Johnny Cash fan. Because Johnny Cash was a pretty big rebel, and he loved Johnny Cash. I had no idea. Everybody everybody does stuff like that. Everybody has had struggles. Everybody makes mistakes, including you, and you're going to make a whole lot more before it's all said and done. And probably so are they, but they understand that more than you do. So if your reaction is one of like shock and horror, you're probably going to lose them. I know if someone does that to me, if I'm telling them something and I'm trying to be honest, and the look on their face says, "Oh no," it's like, I'm not telling you anything else. Like, you're just sitting there judging me. Why would I waste my time? So it's really important to be neutral. It really is in interviews, and to really be interested and to keep coaxing, because that's when they really will say the most. Be critical. I don't think you're going to find a lot of inconsistencies until after the interview. This is normally very important, but I don't think you're going to notice these because they're going to just because of the kind of interview you're doing. But don't be surprised if, maybe you do some research or you talk to someone in your family and find out that some of the things you were told are either inaccurate or just lies. Once in a while that happens. It's rare, but once in a while I have a student report that to me. Remembering is important. Like, you got to know what was said. I'm repeating it, I know, but it's important. Interpreting, you're going to listen to what they say, but it's going to be your understanding of what they say that ultimately makes the biggest difference. That's what's going to come through in your writing. And that's a good thing. Like, you're going to try to make sense of their experience. They're not going to do that for you. You're going to tell what it means and why it was valuable. Not and then balanced. Don't do all don't do all the talking. I know I keep bringing that up, but an interview is not a conversation. it's an interview, and your job as an interviewer is to listen and to keep. And when you do talk, it's about getting more information from them. So people dislike the man for a lot of because I guess he was kind of a creep. But Charlie Rose is actually a very good interviewer. I think he's still alive, but he doesn't really have much of a career anymore. But he was very good at asking simple questions and listening. His interviews always focused on the person he was talking to. Whereas like some interviewers, like I was listening to Howard Stern once, who's actually kind of an interesting guy to listen to when he interviews because he is a very good listener, but like he tends to answer people's questions for them. And that's not a good technique if you're trying to get people to really open up, especially if the person doesn't know you very well. So there's lots of good interviewers out there, but Charlie Rose is just sort of a master. Oh, there was one more slide. Last thing is be patient. That's kind of the golden rule of interviewing. Let people finish. Don't rush. Don't rush. If it's someone you know, like if it's grandma, uncle so-and-so, mom, dad, whatever, you kind of have to get all of the family stuff out of the way and remind them, I'm here to do some work. Like I want to learn about this thing that you did. And so it's great to talk and, do that, get that out of the way. But then I want to talk to you about this because I think it's gonna be interesting and I think it's gonna help other people. And then when they start talking, let them talk because it can be more difficult to interview someone you know in that respect because you're familiar with them and like you want to take over or that's not how you normally interact. It's not very formal. Whereas if it's someone you don't know, you're going to follow these rules a little more closely. But it's really important to be patient, whether you know the person or not, and to let them finish and to kind of coax them into better answers and more detailed answers. So those are just some basics of interviewing. Do you guys have any questions?
So the whole point of the assignment is to interview someone about some event in history. Doesn't matter much about what event it is, just someone about it.
Yeah, I mean, and when I say history, I mean something that happened. Not you obviously can't interview someone about something that's going to happen, and it's pretty hard to interview someone about something that's happening right now. So you could. So we're kind of sticking with things that did happen. But I mean, that could be really recent. I know I've had students in the last 3 semesters write about the pandemic, which it's like, oh, great, more about the pandemic for me. But there is a lot. But I think it's more interesting to write about the pandemic if you find a perspective. Like I think one student wrote about an aunt who was a nurse during the pandemic, and that was actually really interesting because I don't really talk to a lot of nurses, who've been working in the COVID wards, or even doctors would be interesting if you can, get time with them. So there's even like I have a friend, a former student actually, who I still talk to periodically, and she's a respiratory therapist, I think. Which during COVID, they're really important because they're the ones who are looking at the lung capacity, which early in COVID was really important. People lost their ability to breathe almost, or in some cases completely. And so she would be someone I think that would be really interesting to interview. Now this is a former student, but she was a student of mine in like 2006. So she has kids. She actually goes to my church. That's the only reason I know. I ran into her again. But I think she would have a really interesting perspective. Or like, if you have a parent that is a frontliner, that could be an interesting thing to write about. But there's all kinds of other great stuff. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be something like when the church burned down in my hometown, it was like the world ended. I mean, it was like people were devastated. The church was the focal point of the town. It was a huge source of pride, huge. And it was a pretty old church. I think it was close to 100 years old. It was like the first church built in town that wasn't a log cabin, and people were really proud of it. And so like there was a hangover of a few weeks where people just kind of wandered around just distraught, this thing that it was like someone was trying to destroy the community. And then after a few months, they decided to build a new one, and then they built this monster behemoth with marble. It was like completely over the top, and it was huge. But I think, it was kind of like, but that next church was like, hey, you want to take us down? No, we're gonna fight back. And so they built this church to say like, hey, this is still important to us. We still care about, like, we're not going to let one little burnt down church stop us from, accomplishing the things that we want to accomplish. So, Allison asked if this person had to be related. They do not. This can be anyone. I actually had one student last semester. She interviewed um, an employee at LCC, like she's a success coach. She interviewed a success coach. I'd be fine with that. And it was a really good essay. She did a great job on it. Um, and so, I mean, I think you can be really like it really can be anyone that especially someone you like. Um, Melanie, you could, yeah, depending on I mean, it's up to you. Like, his story, and if you think it's one that's interesting, or he can, where he was kind of part of the front line, so to speak. Yeah, you could. So think about it. Who you interview is important, but also I think it's more important because you'll learn so much more from the experience if you choose someone that kind of gives you new insights. Like the reader and the writer learn a lot more and are more surprised by what they hear. So, any other questions?
So when we go to like this, like if I have an idea of a person, do I come to
Mhm.
them with like idea of a topic, or do I just say, hey, what's something interesting that you would want to talk about?
Well, I think if you don't know the person or if you know the person but don't know what you're going to interview them about. So like a couple of students have said, I'm going to interview so and so who did this or saw this or was a part of this. That's fine. But if you know who you want to interview but you're not real sure about what to interview them about, yeah, Samuel, I would ask them what's something that you in your life that was really that you're really proud of or was really meaningful. Like one of my students wrote about how his grandfather started a construction company, and I think he was like broke when he did it, and it became very successful. Like I can't remember the name of it, but it was like one of the local construction companies I'd heard of. So it kind of depends, and it was a good interview because like his grandfather devoted like his whole adult life, well, not his whole adult life, but I think from the time he was like in his mid 30s on to building this company so that his family could inherit it, and if they wanted it, they could keep it. It would be it was like his legacy, and he wanted to hand it down to his kids and maybe even his grandkids. So yeah, I would ask the person, what's something that you've done or that you've seen or experienced in your life that changed or affected you profoundly. And maybe that's what the assignment should be. I don't know, but I like the historical part of it because if there, like if you can find someone with historical perspective, it will help you understand history better. On the other hand, it's really interesting to talk to someone about something they love or that they're proud of, or both. So that's why I keep it pretty open-ended. There is a handout on this. I probably should have gone through the handout, but it's in week 8 this week. And the prompt, there's not really a prompt necessarily. It's just steps that we're going to take, and we're going to kind of you go through the steps. So the first step, obviously, is to try to find someone and set up the interview. The next step will be writing, and when we get to that point, we'll actually look at like how do you write this essay versus the last essay, like what last 2 essays, how is this one going to be different, because it is going to be different, and it's going to be graded differently as well.
So you will go over how to write this essay because that was my next question.
Yeah, I will, because you'll have an interview, and then the next question you'll have is, Instructor Manning, what do I do with all this? I don't know if that was your experience, Maisie, but it did seem like most students came to my office or to our conferences for SA3 and like, what do I do with this? And then we had to kind of, it helps to talk through that, because sometimes because you don't know what you're going to get. It was like one of the students in Maisie's class, he interviewed his grandmother about, she lived in the South during integration in the 60s, and he was going to interview her about that, thinking that she would kind of be like, it was a good thing and all that kind of stuff. And that's not how it went. Turns out his grandmother preferred segregation and used words like, those people are always causing trouble. And he was like, he walked out and he didn't know what, and he actually did a good job of like not being like, because I know he was thinking that, but he's like, my nana, my nana's, he kept saying that during my conference with him. He's like, I can't believe my nana said this stuff. Like, it's horrible. And but he was surprised that she thought that. But I said, well, that's, so he's like, what do I do with this? It's not what I expected at all. And I said, well, and so we had to talk about, like, how do you turn this? What's the story? What's the narrative in this? And what we landed on is that that the narrative was really about him and his grandmother saying all this, and like how his reaction to it and what he learned about integration and about, segregation and how people view it, what he learned from all that. So, yeah, you just don't know until you do the interview what the options are. For me, it's kind of fun because I can sit down with you and we can talk about, we can kind of overcome that problem. It's not like the conferences. If we have conferences, they're not going to be like, all right, you need to work on this and this and this and this and this. It's going to be much more of like, well, what do I'll ask you, like, I'll be interviewing you basically, like, what did she say then, and what did she mean by this, and that sort of thing. So yeah, you just don't know what you're going to get, and that's kind of the fun for me. And hopefully you'll kind of look at it the same way, as like, if you go into it thinking you know exactly what's going to happen, you're probably going to be wrong, especially if it's, even if it's someone you might probably going to be off. Such is life. Any other questions? So really, with this essay, it's really important to follow the process and not get ahead of yourself, because it will make you really anxious if you have this, like, these interview notes and you're not really sure what to do with them. It can be, and that's when students start to kind of get hyper about it. But that's just, once you have a plan, it's just going to look different than your other papers. There's an interview, there's some kind of there's an introduction and a conclusion, but the rest of the paper is going to look very different. It's not going to be 3 or 4 paragraphs. It's going to be whatever it is, whatever makes sense. And the simplest way to write this paper is just simply to start at the beginning and finish at the end, to follow it chronologically. That's the simplest way to structure the paper. There will be little bits and pieces we'll talk about. We're going to actually discuss description and dialogue, because you may decide to include that, but it's not going to be a 5-paragraph or 6-paragraph essay. Any other questions? Okay, yeah, you could, Melanie, you could do that. I'm gonna I forgot to show you guys this one last thing in Google Docs. I'm gonna just switch over to that quick, and then we'll take a short break. And then, all right. So with Google Docs, they have this voice-activated typing, and one way that you could transcribe the interview would be to record it with Google Docs, period. This works pretty well. And it's actually gotten better over the last couple of years and tends to capture things fairly well. The one thing it doesn't do is add periods. Period. So I did it for us. But you can see it just captures everything that's said, and it keeps up pretty well. So if you wanted a transcript, this is how I would get a transcript. You can take notes, you can record it, whatever else you want to do, but this is how I would have a transcript. Now, by the time you're finished, it's going to look something like what's being typed out here. And as you can see, I'm talking pretty fast. It seems to be able to keep up with me. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. So that's Google Docs. You guys have that part as part of your account. If you're going to use Google Docs and you're going to use voice typing, you actually have to use Chrome. And if you don't use Chrome, it won't work. It's like the voice typing is right here under Tools. And if you don't use Chrome, it doesn't actually show up. So it's one of those things where you've got to use Chrome. Like, Google's forcing us into it. We don't have much choice no matter, because I was trying to do this on my Mozilla browser and voice typing doesn't even come up. So it has to be Chrome. But you can see it works really well. And it's actually a way to write a paper if you want. Like, if you prefer to speak rather than type, your typing's not that great, it keeps up. And what I've noticed is, like, the first time I used this, it did a pretty poor job of voice recognition. But the voice recognition is much, much better now. So you spend a lot less time going back over it and correcting it when you're finished. So that is Google Docs. And again, that's the voice recorder. And it works really well. And it keeps up everything I have to say. And blah, 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 blah. Yeah, see? It's impressive. Very, very impressive. And it's free. And you guys all have that as part of your Gmail account. So you might as well take advantage of it. But that, I think, would be a great way to capture the interview if you're looking for a way to do it. And it's because it's like it's transcribed for you. To do that from a recording will take you 3 or 4 hours, and you'll want to jump off a building when you're finished. It's just maddening. It's a horrible job to have. I did it a couple times. I had a student do it last semester, and I just thought, oh, I felt so bad for her, because then she still had to write the paper, and it was overwhelming. It was very overwhelming. All right, let's take like a 5-minute bio break. And when you come back, we're actually going to work on a list of questions you guys can use in your interviews. So 5 minutes, and then we'll get back at it at 11:28. Okay, everybody. So I'm going to put you guys into groups, and what I'd like you to do in each group is just simply come up with 5 interview questions. I'm going to put a link in the chat that will take you to a Google Doc, and then I'll actually upload the Google Doc or send it out to you via email, or just maybe even upload it into week 8 somewhere. We're just going to make a list, compile a list of what we think are really good interview questions. I'm also going to have, there is actually a list of questions, and never mind, you can't access them yet. So anyway, in groups, 5 questions, 5 good interview questions. They can be general questions, and then people can like tailor them, but try to come up with 5 good interview questions. All right, so I'm going to put the link in the chat to the Google Doc that you'll use, and there it is. And then I'm going to put all of you into groups starting right now. Azariah, I have no idea why you're not in a breakout session. So let me try to get you into one. Okay, so everybody's back. So I want to go through the questions a little bit. There is, like I said, there is sort of there's some things to keep in mind as you develop questions. And the other thing to remember too is you're writing kind of generic questions. They could be kind of tailored to what it is or who it is you're interviewing, depending. So these are going to be kind of generic questions that you will use individually. One of the things to remember with the questions is I'm sorry, let me back up again. The document that you guys are putting all these questions on, I'll leave it open, and like I said, I'll try to post the Microsoft Word version of it on D2L. But these are not these are questions that are meant to be shared. They're meant to be used by everybody. So if there's one you really like, copy and paste it into your own list of questions. Again, you're shooting for between 10 and 15 questions. 10 probably will do it if you have good questions. Or you can have a few extras, and you'll ask follow-up questions, which usually aren't prepared, but this will be a good start. So I'm going to share the screen again so we can go through these a bit. All right. So I've kind of looked through these already. And one thing that group one did well was they focused more on the person being interviewed. So the questions had much more to do with who are we talking to and what was their experience, because we kind of know that they're going to have a hard time discussing someone else's experience. Now we can ask them what other people thought, and they might tell us, but that should be sort of a minor question. That's not something that's going to help us really develop a good narrative. So how does this event still affect you today? And again, that's a question you might ask at the end of the interview. Once they've talked about all the things that that you want them to talk about, or they want to talk about, or both, at the end, you might get to that. This would be a good question to sum up what their feelings are. And it also might be a good idea to put the answer to this question in your conclusion of your essay. So it's really like a multi-function question. It can be very helpful in finishing up the interview and the paper. What were your thoughts during this event? What made this event? See how simple these sentences or these questions are. Very few words, very open-ended. What made this event so impactful? Who was impacted by the event? How have you observed the perspective view of this event? Oh, so how has the perspective changed over time? So how has your perspective of this event changed over time? That's always a good question. Again, another question you might want to ask at the end, once they've talked about the event. Has this event led to some unseen positives later on? That's a good question. We always think about the negative, but yeah, did anything good come out of this? Yeah, I don't think I've ever had that question asked before. If I did, I don't remember. So it's pretty much like it never happened. How does your personal experience of this event differ from the public opinion? Oh, that's a good question. It's like you guys were listening to our last class, and you actually were thinking about the discussion boards. And yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, that's really interesting. What about this event stood out to you most? Another good question. So I'd say like 7 and 8 are good questions to ask right in the middle. So like question 4, 5, 6, 7. They're not really like a summation. They're much more about like kind of when you're into the discussion. The early questions should just be like, where did you live and what were you doing, and getting them warmed up, getting their memory kind of warmed up too. Like, what were you doing and what did you think and what were you like and all that kind of stuff. And then you get into like, describe the event, or tell me about what can you tell me about the event? What are some moments you remember from the event? And then you can ask follow-up questions to that. But those are kind of like the middle or early questions where they're just telling you what happened. And then if you look at the questions 1 and 2, those are much more reflective questions where it's kind of like, I've told you what happened, now this is kind of what I think about that. So question 1, group 2, this is kind of 2 questions. What year were they born? What era did they live through? I would try to know that going in, what the era is. But if you don't be afraid to ask a lot of questions, because it is really hard for some students or it is hard to know, like if you're walking into an interview and you're letting them kind of decide, or like you're not really sure what it is they're going to talk about, which I would try to nail that down beforehand so you can have good questions prepared. But if it's not something you're familiar with and you can't research it, be prepared. Like, don't be afraid to ask a whole lot of questions. Really don't be, because that people like, hopefully they want to answer like if it were me, I'd love answering the questions. That just shows interest. Whenever someone asks you a question, it's like they want to know what you think or what you experienced. They're curious about you. That's a compliment. You're interesting enough to know. What was going on in your head as the event occurred? That could be a good one. Sometimes it's a short answer though. I mean, I think sometimes people are surprised at how brief that answer is. But yeah, that's a good question. How much of an impact did it make on your life? So like, again, that's a question. And then what are your thoughts on it today? That's a separate question. So I would ask those as 2 questions, not 1, and both are reflective, so they would probably come at the end of the interview. If you were a person with a different perspective, how do you think you might have reacted? So like that question is interesting, except it's complicated. It also requires that the person think from someone else's point of view, and that might be, they might just say, I don't know. How am I supposed to know that? So I don't know that I would use that question, just because I think in terms of gathering information, you might not get much out of that. In fact, I could see getting very little out of it. Now if you ask me that question, I don't know. I'd have a hard time answering that one, honestly, if you ask me about really anything. So I'd think about that one. You could ask, how might you have reacted differently today, now that years have passed? That might be a way to get a little bit more out of that, because then it's more of a reflective question. If you could go back in time and change something, what would it be? Yeah, that's a good question. Again, a reflective question that would come at the end, but yeah, that's a good question. That's an interesting idea. And then what was one thing that changed your outlook on life? Again, a reflective question. So you want reflective questions, but you don't want you want half of your questions to be, what happened? Describe this, describe that. What were a couple, what was what is a moment or an event that you remember best? What was another event or moment you remember? What was a story, a funny story or a sad story you remember? Like those are things that encourage them to tell you something about what happened. And then there's also like detailed questions where you ask, they talk about music, you ask them, what kind of music were you listening to? What was the band? Blah, 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 blah. Or, if they're talking about brushing your teeth, what kind of toothbrush did you use? Or what kind of toothpaste did you use? There's little details that will work really well in your essay that you can always follow up with. Just if they're talking about a car, what kind of car? Like, especially men always remember cars. What kind of car were you driving? Or if it's a woman, like, what kind of makeup did you wear? What kind of perfume did you wear? What kind of dress were you wearing? What kind of shoes were, like just little stuff that or you think they might have remembered. And but like that stuff, those questions seem minor, but they pay off with little details in the story itself. And you're going to see that when you start reading and start listening to the stories that are assigned for this class, like the war questions. That little, you don't have to watch necessarily the whole thing. It's like 2 hours long, but if you listen to those interviews, they all remember details, very specific details, happy details, sad details, but details nonetheless. And they all recount World War II through a series of stories. And some of the people being interviewed are women who did not fight in World War II, and yet they're every bit as emotional as anyone else during their interviews. The soldiers say things like, one of the soldiers says something there, and I don't know if anyone's prepared for it, but he's like, he saw his friend get bombed by a Japanese bomber dropped a bomb directly on his friend and just blew him apart. And the soldier saw that, and he said, after that, I didn't care about killing him. And then he said, in fact, I hunted them. If I didn't kill a few a day, I was disappointed in myself. And like, it's a stark thing. Like, it's one of those things where you hear it, you think, oh wow, like, and you know, he was so honest about it, and that's what made it so good. So like the answers are your answers. You want them to kind of be answering the questions as stories, which means you want questions that kind of ask for that. So what is an event or a moment you really remember? What's another one? And then ask detail or follow-up questions to those. Where were you at this event? So this is a question that will probably be answered pretty quickly. I was here. Not a very open-ended. That to me would be like a detailed question, a follow-up question, where they're talking and then they don't tell you where they are, and you're like, hey, wait a second, where were you? What did you think when this event took place? Yeah, like I said before, that can be something simple, or that might yield a good answer, but it might be something like, I was afraid. I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to remember what you think. I don't remember that. Like, I think about, like, you know, someone interviewed me about some of the more pivotal moments of my life. I don't think I would remember what I was thinking. I remember what I was seeing, and I remembered what I was doing. Like, when I was a kid, my dad he was actually literally run over by a tractor. And I remember because my mom was angry with me, which was nothing new. And I was in the house and I had to do dishes. I was 7 years old. My friend had just left. He'd spent the night, and we'd gotten into a little bit of trouble, and quite a bit of trouble actually. And and all I heard was screaming. And I ran outside as fast as I could. And my mom was screaming, and she was holding on to my sisters, who were only about a year or two old, probably almost 2 years old. And my dad was sitting on a tractor, and his head was on the steering wheel like this. That's all I remember. I don't remember what was going through my head. I remember what I saw. And so I'd keep that in mind, that, you know, those are, and then I had to, in order to know what happened, I actually had to piece the pieces together because I didn't see it. And so everybody else in my family saw it except for me. And so everybody in the family started, like my dad, because my dad was conscious, my mom and my brother, both of my brothers, had to recall what they saw, and then we had to put all the pieces together as to what actually happened. So I think it was really like, you really want them to recount what they saw, not what they thought. You can help them with that. You can help them with, because it'll be pretty self-evident that they were, you know, what emotions they were dealing with, but and then what they saw will give you the detail. What did you learn from this event? That's reflective, so that would come at the end. Where did this event take place? Again, that'll be a one-word answer, so we want to be careful there. How has the event impacted you as a person? Again, good question, but that would be more of a reflective question, so it would come at the end. I've added a few other questions. I think quite a few of these you've already asked. Yeah, I think you guys have already written those down. So the question, so I'm going to put a couple up here that I would like to see you do. So I'm going to add like some follow-up questions. Can you see why I like voice activated typing now? So there's a couple. I think, I know it's so simple, but describe, and then what was an event you experienced, or what was an important, what moment do you most remember? Something along those lines, open-ended, and again, you're trying to get stories out of them. I think watching the videos sort of helped me in developing this assignment, better understand what kind of questions get the best answers. But the other part of it is like when you ask open-ended questions, so much of it too is just letting people go until they absolutely run out of gas, like just letting them keep telling stories. As long as they're on topic or they're still talking about the same thing, you're okay. But also don't be afraid to redirect people. If they're getting away from the discussion or the questions or the answers that you're looking for, try to move them back in. Okay, I appreciate, that's interesting. Could you tell me more about blank? Could you tell me more about this experience? All right, so I'm going to check the chat. I think there were some chat questions that I'll go through. Oh, okay. I think I missed something, Lucas. Sorry about that. Why is always a good question. Again, it's reflective though. Oh, I think that's everybody. Okay. So that's what we're looking at with the questions. Again, feel free to go back and take a look at those. There's also a list of questions on D2L, but I think your list is actually going to be more helpful. Are there any other questions so far? So one of the assignments, and I'll open it when I open up this week 9 and 10, you'll be able to see this assignment. But one of the assignments is to turn in your questions for the interview. So make sure you have a list of questions for the interview, and also make sure you ask if you can follow up, so that if there's a question that you should have asked and didn't, you still can, because that can be really helpful as well. It seems like follow-up interviews they really help students a lot. So one of the questions that I got in the chat is, how big should the event be? And I think the size of an event is relative to the person telling it. It's subjective. I mean, like I said, a church burning down is not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but it is if you live in the town that it burned down in and you went to the church. What happened at the Capitol a few months ago is probably, like, even though it's frustrating and maybe for some people or justified in other people's minds, it doesn't affect us that closely because we didn't know someone who was killed in the skirmish. And I think to some degree we feel like politicians sort of, like they kind of get on our nerves, and I don't want to say it's justified, but we're like, it's a bunch of politicians, finally, doing something quickly for a change. But I do think I do think it's relative, that's why I think it's good to ask people, if you know who you want to interview, but you don't know what you want to interview them about, it's good to ask them, because there are like student asked her grandma if she could interview her, and her grandma said, okay. And she said, well, is there anything that I could interview, like you think would be interesting for me to interview you about? And she said, yeah, I'll get back to you. And she called back like a day later, and she's like, you can interview me about being a woman, a female executive for a corporation in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, which was a big deal. Like, and she talked about, the interview was about the sexism that she endured as a woman during that time and how she was treated different. Like, people would always tell her to go get coffee, and she was an executive, like she was a VP of a company, and they're like, go get some coffee, hon, will you? It's like, hun, it was like watching, I don't know if you've ever watched Mad Men, but it was kind of like that was how she described the work environment. So, and that was important to her, and so, like, the interview was a lot more interesting because of that. So, again, I think it's relative to the person who experienced it. If you knew someone who fought in Vietnam, they're not going to forget it. No one does. Like, no one, I had a student whose grandfather didn't actually fire a bullet at anyone during Vietnam. He was in a boat the whole time, traveling around the world, and he remembered it because it was like the best experience of his life. He got to go to all these different cities in Italy and the Netherlands and South America and just all over the world. He loved it for like 4 years. He just got to see every part of the world. And so his memory of Vietnam was like positive. So I think you have to understand that it really depends on the person. I know that's not a great answer, Mason, but that's kind of the truth of it. And you'll kind of get a sense of that once you start interviewing the person. Can we interview more than one subject about the same event or essay? Yeah, students have done that, Allison, and it can work pretty well, especially if like one person remembers things differently than the other. I had a student last semester interview her grandparents. Her grandfather, I think, was from Michigan, and her grandmother, her great-grandmother, maybe his great-grandmother, I don't remember, was from was Dutch, I think, and like basically just came back with her great-grandfather or grandfather, I don't remember. Anyway, just was like they married each other on the spot, and then they came back to Michigan and started a life together. And she was like, she was in a whole new country. The only person she knew was her husband, and so like how they remembered that experience was very different. So yeah, it can work. Anybody else? Okay, we're way over time, so I got to let you guys go, but we will talk soon. Let me know if you have any questions, and try to schedule those interviews soon. Like, don't wait. That's why we went over this now, so that you could schedule them during spring break if possible. Because the sooner you get that interview done, the sooner you'll be able to start working on the essay, and the sooner things will start to fall into place. So guys, have a good spring break. Make sure you come back. Don't forget about me or this class specifically. And let me know if you have any questions. I will be checking my email during break, probably not every day, but periodically. Maisie, can you stay on for a second?
Have a good day.
All right, you guys